Benvenuto, everybody. I'm Dee, and this is my feline life mate, Stud. In this video, we're going to deep dive into the life and crimes of one of America's most notorious serial killers, Ed Kemper. Known as the Co-Ed Killer, Kemper's story is as chilling as it is complex, filled with disturbing twists that have intrigued true crime enthusiasts and psychologists alike for decades. We're going to explore the dark and twisted life of Ed while examining some of the events that shaped him into the unfortunate monster he became. Ed's story is truly one of nature versus nurture. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the invaluable work of Ed Kemper's stories, whose extensive research and reporting have provided crucial insights into this case. If you're interested in learning more about Ed Kemper, I strongly suggest you visit their website. The link is in the description box below. Ed Kemper, famous, or should I say infamous, for his criminal activities in the early 1970s, was among several individuals responsible for a series of tragic events that gripped Southern California. His crimes were often mentioned alongside those of Herbert Mullen, whose crimes were sometimes mistakenly attributed to Kemper. Other notable figures who terrorized California from that era included the Golden State Killer, later identified through genealogy as Joseph James D'Angelo, and the still questionably unidentified Zodiac Killer. These names represent a particularly unsettling period in California's history. On December 18, 1948, Edmund Kemper III was born in Burbank, California, to Edmund Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Elizabeth Stage Kemper. Nicknamed Guy, he was the middle child of three siblings. His oldest sister was Susan, and his youngest was Alan. Clarnell and Edmund's marriage wouldn't last, and Ed's father left the family in 1957 when Ed was just 9 years old. Edmund, who had spent time in the military, would recall living with his ex-wife this way: suicide missions in wartime and the later atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell. After 3 failed marriages under Clarnell's belt, Ed himself quipped, "She went through men like a hot knife through butter." After her last divorce, Clarnell packed up her family and moved to Helena, Montana. Much like the elder Kemper described, living with Clarnell was anything but pleasant. She was a violent alcoholic who seemed hell-bent on humiliating and belittling Ed. She forced him to sleep in the basement, a trap door in the floor of the kitchen under the kitchen table being the only means of ingress and egress, and a single bulb that hung from the rafters as his only source of light. Her reasoning? She was concerned he'd harm his sisters during the night, even though there was no evidence of Ed ever being inappropriate with either one of them. Ed's father recalled, "He was terrified of this place. There was only one way out. Someone had to move the kitchen table and lift the trap door. I put a stop to it and threatened her with the law." To the surprise of absolutely no one, it was during that time alone, locked in the dark basement, that Ed began to develop sick and twisted fantasies. Now, Clarnell wasn't just accused of locking Ed in the basement at night. She also refused to show him any signs of affection for fear it would, quote, turn him gay. She berated him for being just like his dad, telling him that no woman would ever love him. Joke's on you, Clarnell. Ed was engaged to be married at the time of his eventual arrest. Anyway, even Ed's older sister Susan partook in some of the abuse against Ed. Allegedly, according to Ed, she attempted to push him in front of an oncoming train, as well as pushed him into the deep end of a swimming pool, knowing full well he was unable to swim. Were these actual physical attempts at harming Ed, or was it more like sibling rivalry type roughhousing? It's also been noted that Ed enjoyed playing games that were, for lack of a better word, weird. He would play gas chamber and electric chair with his sisters and friends, having them pretend to flip the switch while he writhed around in pain in a chair or on the floor. When asked about these games, Ed chalked it up to just being bored and finding something ridiculous to do with their time. Ed was also asked about the time he decapitated and dismembered his sister's dolls. He shrugged and said there was no ill intent other than to get her back for breaking his beloved BB gun. He knew she loved her toys just as much as he loved his. Although it's been reported otherwise, I could find no evidence of Ed admitting to, quote, bizarre sexual rituals with his sister's dolls. He simply destroyed them in retaliation. Unfortunately, as Ed grew older, his dark fantasies turned violent and ultimately fantasy turned to reality. He began, as most sadistic killers do, by torturing and killing animals, with the family cat being one of his first victims. Ed said he focused his aggression on the cat because it fancied his sister over him. Gee whiz, Ed, I wonder why. At age 15, Ed left Montana to live with his father in Van Nuys, California, but that wouldn't last for very long. Ed found out that his father had a new family, complete with a stepson, and there was simply no room for Ed, figuratively speaking. Fact is, Edmund's new wife, a stunning blonde named Elfriede, didn't like Ed at all and claimed that his mere presence gave her migraines. He had to go. Under the guise of just paying them a visit, Edmund took Ed to his paternal grandparents, Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr., where he was left to live with them, permanently. The elder Kempers lived on a ranch in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada mountain range, atop a mountain several miles away from town. Completely blindsided, Ed compared his time at the ranch to being in jail. Ed considered his grandmother very domineering and emasculating, reminding him of his own mother. Ed claimed Maud wouldn't allow him to participate in after-school activities. She monitored what he watched on television and refused to allow him to have friends over. On the other hand, he did have great admiration for his grandfather, who Ed said was a pretty fierce guy when he was younger. Regardless, Ed felt isolated, resentful, and angry. Ed Sr. had bought a gun for Ed, a .22 rifle, and taught him how to shoot. Ed spent his days on the isolated ranch shooting small animals and rodents, birds and gophers and the like, much to the dismay of his grandmother. At her behest, Ed Sr. ultimately took the gun back. On August 27, 1964, when he was just 15 years old, Ed Kemper killed his grandparents. Using the .22 rifle, which had been previously confiscated, he pointed the barrel at the back of his grandmother's head through an open window and shot her while she worked at the kitchen table. Not satisfied she was dead, he put another bullet into her skull and then walked back inside and dragged her lifeless body into the bedroom, where he proceeded to stab her 3 times. Ed's grandfather wasn't home at the time he killed Maud, and Ed was worried about what he might do or say upon finding his dead wife in the house. When his grandfather did get home, Ed greeted him in the driveway, presumably to help him carry grocery bags from the car to the house. Instead, Ed snuck up behind Ed Sr., and, according to Ed, I placed the rifle about 30 inches from the back of his head and shot him. Ed dragged his grandfather's body into the garage and washed the blood from his hands with a garden hose. He also attempted to clean the blood from the driveway, then stopped to call his mother and confess what he had done. Clarnell insisted Ed call the police, who promptly arrested the boy. When asked why he shot his grandparents, he said, quote, "I just wanted to know what it felt like to kill Grandma." His grandfather was nothing more than collateral damage. Kemper was placed under the supervision of the California Youth Authority, where he underwent several evaluations. These tests revealed that he possessed an exceptionally high IQ, but also indicated signs of paranoid schizophrenia. Eventually, Kemper was transferred to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security institution for inmates with mental health issues. There, Ed was a model prisoner, became a member of the local JCs, and even helped administer some of the psychological tests to other inmates, specifically sexual offenders, where he would memorize the answers he knew doctors wanted to hear. This aided in his own release. On December 18, 1969, his 21st birthday, Ed was released and returned to live with his mother, much to his doctor's chagrin. The family resided at 609A Ord Road in Aptos, California. Once back home, Ed Kemper appeared to be on a path towards normalcy. He worked various jobs and tried to reintegrate into society, finally landing a job with the California Department of Transportation. However, his relationship with his mother remained strained and volatile. Clarnell's constant belittling and emotional abuse continued to fuel the anger and resentment that had been building within Ed for years, and it was during this time that Ed's dark fantasies began to resurface. Sadly, he started to act on them in ways that would shock the nation. Between May 1972 and April 1973, Ed Kemper embarked on a horrifying killing spree that would claim the lives of 6 young women. His modus operandi involved picking up female hitchhikers, often college students from UC Santa Cruz, where his mother happened to work as an administrative assistant. According to Ed, he would pick up hundreds of women with no issue, but used many of those opportunities to perfect his abduction technique. Thanks to Mama Clarnell, Ed had a UC Santa Cruz campus parking sticker, which seemed to put all the girls at ease, especially as news about missing college co-eds grew. Ed also figured out how to jimmy the passenger door, leaving the door locked and inoperable from the inside. Kemper's methods were chillingly calculated. He would often engage in conversation with his victims to put them at ease before driving to secluded locations, where he would brutally murder them in various ways. Afterwards, he would take their bodies back to his home, where he would dismember and desecrate them before scattering their body parts throughout the county. Because the media loves a good, scary moniker, they would later dub him the Co-ed Killer or the Co-ed Butcher. Ed rarely committed these crimes while sober. He would usually head out after a fight with his mother, and usually while under intense pressure. He also described the feeling he had when his, quote, killer personality took over, that two beings inhabited his body and it was, quote, kind of like blacking out. He indicated that the same thing had happened when he shot his grandmother. Whatever, Ed, you killed cats without blacking out, so I don't want to hear it. What made Ed Kemper's case even more disturbing was his ability to evade capture for nearly a year. Despite the increasing number of missing persons reports and the discovery of mutilated bodies, law enforcement struggled to identify the perpetrator. Kemper, with his towering 6'9" frame and seemingly polite demeanor, did not fit the typical profile of a serial killer. He even frequented a local bar popular with police officers called the Jury Room, where he would casually discuss the ongoing investigation, all the while knowing full well that he was the man they were hunting. Fun fact, Ed was interested in becoming a police officer himself, but his size and his weight disqualified him. Today, a young man his size would probably be in high demand. Imagine Ed Kemper in full riot gear. Ed's final murders were his most personal and, arguably, his most tragic. On April 20th, 1973, Kemper killed his mother Clarnell in their home. The years of pent-up rage and hatred culminated in a gruesome act of violence.
That's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that, came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. And I looked at her, I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her, you know? And I'm so cold, it's so hard. And that's the first time in 10 years I've looked at it that way. I mean, that intensely, that honestly. It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. See? I came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son. This is one of our arguments. And I cut off her head. And I humiliated her corpse. I said, there. You know? A 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had.
After striking her repeatedly with a claw hammer, Ed decapitated his mother and used her severed head for acts too horrific to detail. The next day, he invited his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, to the house, where he punched her, then choked her to death in the crook of his arm before beheading her. He left a note for law enforcement, then fled the home in her car. Kemper later confessed that he killed Sally to create a cover story for his mother's disappearance. Realizing that his spree could not continue, Ed Kemper made the extraordinary decision to turn himself in. After driving as far as Pueblo, Colorado, and nearly delusional on no dose and zero sleep, Ed called the Santa Cruz Police Department from a payphone and confessed to the murders. At first, the officers thought he was joking, since Ed was somewhat of an acquaintance and appeared jovial and harmless, a gentle giant, if you will. It wasn't until he provided details only the killer could know that they finally took him seriously. Ed was apprehended without incident and fully cooperated with authorities. He provided a detailed account of his crimes and the motivations behind them, expressing a twisted sense of relief that he had been caught. During his trial, he was found guilty on all counts, and even though he had requested the death penalty, Ed was sentenced to 8 life sentences to be served concurrently. Upon his initial incarceration, Ed attempted to off himself with drugs and by cutting his wrists. Instead of being treated at the prison's hospital for his declining mental health, he was returned to isolation, where he claims he was comatose for 3 days. Coincidentally, Ed was housed with Herbert Mullen for a while. Ed had a great disdain for Herb. He thought he was, quote, a little shit who would go out of his way to annoy the other inmates. What's funny is, in an interview from the 1990s, Ed called Herb a little wimpy guy. I guess to Ed's 6'9", Herbie's 5'9" seemed demure. I'll leave a link to the interview in the description box below. It's interesting to hear Ed talk about how he used behavior modification on Herb to basically get him to sit down and shut up. While incarcerated, Ed Kemper has become known for his surprising contributions to prison life and beyond. Despite his heinous crimes, Kemper has taken on various responsibilities that have garnered him a level of respect within the prison system. Notably, he became a prolific narrator for audiobooks, lending his deep, resonant voice to recording hundreds of titles, including classics like The Complete Works of Edgar Allan Poe and Flowers in the Attic. These recordings have been widely used in programs for the visually impaired.
Reaching for the internal controls, 3PO was shocked. "Behave yourself, R2," he finally chastised his companion. "You're going to get us into trouble."
Incredibly, Ed's interactions with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit have played a significant role in shaping the field of criminal profiling. After his conviction, Kemper became one of the first serial killers to cooperate extensively with the FBI, providing invaluable insights into the mind of a serial offender. Agents Robert Ressler and John E. Douglas, pioneers of criminal profiling, interviewed Kemper in the 1970s as part of their research into the psychology of violent criminals. Kemper's willingness to discuss his motives, methods, and thoughts in detail allowed the FBI to better understand the behavioral patterns of serial killers, helping to develop profiling techniques that are still used today. His candid interviews contributed to the foundational work in criminal psychology and were instrumental in the creation of what became known as the FBI's Criminal Profiling Program. This program has since been pivotal in solving numerous cases involving serial offenders, making Kemper's cooperation, though unsettling, a crucial part of law enforcement history. Ed remains incarcerated to this day at California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. He suffered a stroke, has a pacemaker, is confined to a wheelchair, has terrible eyesight, and has had 2 toes amputated on account of diabetes. In July 2024, he was denied parole yet again, with his next parole date set for 2031. He's currently 75 years old. Ed Kemper's story is one of horror and tragedy, a stark reminder of the potential for evil that can lurk behind even the most seemingly benign exterior. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts like me, as we try to understand the mind of a man who committed such unspeakable acts. For me, my feelings for Ed are torn. I fall back to the nature versus nurture argument and truly believe that had he had a kinder, more supportive mother and a more stable upbringing, the chances of him being a productive member of society and less of a deranged lunatic would probably be significantly higher. Considering all the good he's done while incarcerated, under normal circumstances, I want to believe Ed would thrive. And I bet he'd be a hoot to hang out with. He sure does love to talk, and I certainly have no problem listening. In fact, out of all of the infamous serial killers of our day, 6'9", 300-pound Ed is the least intimidating to me. In any event, I make no excuses for him and his crimes, and my prayers are with the victims and their families. As sympathetic as I am towards his shit childhood, no matter how interesting I find him, he's right where he belongs and should stay there for the rest of his days. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content on true crime and other dark histories. And don't forget to visit the Edmund Kemper Stories website linked below, where you'll find more in-depth info and continuous updates on Big Ed. Let's take a moment to celebrate the lives of Edmund Kemper's 10 known victims.